They were young voices, trained to praise. But on the night they sang, their song ended the parish. No echo remains. No graves were found. Only silence where a hymn once rose. And the records of a choir, that was never heard again. Under the dim light of a parish lantern, the camera drifts slowly down a cobblestone street. Mist hanging low as if it remembers something the living no longer dare to speak. The stone walls breathe cold, carrying the faint echo of hymns that once lifted toward heaven but never returned. It was the year 1891, and the town of Providence was about to celebrate what it believed was a blessing. The parish had announced the forming of a new choir. Not just any choir, but one meant to carry the voice of the parish into the century to come. The priest called them the Voices of Providence. 19 children, chosen carefully, hand-picked, as though their voices were already known. Parents wept with pride. To have a child sing in God's house was not just honor. It was believed to be salvation. Their names would echo inside the chapel long after their bodies had gone. But not everyone celebrated. There were whispers, quiet enough that even the pews strained to hear, that the children were not chosen for the beauty of their voices, but for something much older than music. At first, it felt like chance. The notices had been discreet. A sermon here, a word there, a letter slipped beneath the door. And yet, when the priest stood before the parish to reveal the names, no one could explain how each family already knew. They had been waiting, as though their child had been spoken for long before they were born. The chosen 19 stood at the altar steps on that first Sunday, dressed in robes too large for their frames, the fabric dragging against the stone floor. The townspeople filled the pews, leaning forward to see them better, their faces pale, their voices trembling. One by one, the children sang a note, a single sound, held until it quivered into silence. The congregation wept. They said it was holy. They said it was the closest they had come to heaven on earth. But there were others who left the service with a knot in their stomach, because the children hadn't looked at the crucifix when they sang. Their eyes had drifted lower, to the floor, beneath their feet. The parish itself was not old by European standards, but had been built on something older than the town. Foundations laid on land cleared hastily, with no records kept of what stood there before. And if you asked the elders, they would never say. That night, one father woke to the sound of his daughter humming in her sleep, the same note she had sung in the parish, except now it didn't fade. It carried on breathless, as though her lungs never emptied. When he shook her awake, she opened her eyes, startled, and said she didn't remember singing at all. By the end of that week, Providence was no longer a town of whispers. It was a town of pride. Bakers gave free bread to the families. Seamstresses offered new clothes. Strangers stopped mothers in the street, congratulating them as though they had given birth twice. But behind the curtains, neighbors traded quieter thoughts. Why 19? Why not 20? And why, among all the children, were only these chosen? One boy, Thomas Bell, had been the last to be added to the list. His parents had not expected it. They had not even known he could sing. Yet, when the parish announced his name, the priest's voice did not falter. It was as if he had been waiting for it all along. Thomas did not seem proud. He seemed frightened. He stood apart from the others, hands clenched behind his back, his eyes darting toward the doors, as if measuring how long it might take him to run. But he stayed. They all stayed. The first rehearsal was not held in the daylight. The priest called them together at dusk, when the church was emptied of its congregation. Parents lingered outside the doors, unwilling to leave until the bells tolled curfew. Inside, the children lined up in rows, their small hands folded against their chests. The choir master asked each to sing again, just as they had that Sunday. The voices blended, higher, sharper, purer than any sound the parish had carried before. They rang through the rafters, striking the wooden beams until they groaned like ships at sea. The priest closed his eyes, his lips moving, though no prayer escaped. The choir master asked them to stop, but the children did not. They continued singing, their mouths moving in unison. The same note stretched thin until it began to shake. Their faces were red, their eyes glistening, but not one lowered their voice. Not even Thomas. When they finally fell silent, The echo did not. It lingered, hanging in the air like smoke, as though the walls themselves had learned the song. The choir master dismissed them early that night, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the hymn books. The priest simply smiled, and in that moment, the parish was no longer a place of God. It was a chamber of something listening. Word spread quickly that the children would debut on Easter Sunday. Families sewed finer robes, painted banners, rehearsed processions. The town buzzed with expectation, but the children grew quiet. Where once they laughed in the streets, now they walked in silence. Where once they played outside, now they gathered only in the churchyard, whispering among themselves. They were seen tracing their fingers against the stones of the parish wall, pressing their ears against the ground, humming to themselves in low, secret tones. Parents dismissed it as nerves. But one mother began locking her daughter's door at night, because she had woken 3 times to find her standing barefoot in the hallway, her mouth open, whispering notes she had never learned. By March, the children no longer seemed like children. Their faces were pale, their eyes heavy. They carried themselves like those who had seen something too early in life. But the town ignored it, because Providence had been chosen, and no one wanted to question what had chosen them. The choir was called a blessing, a gift, a miracle, but those who stood at the back of the parish, in the shadows, saw it differently. 19 children had been taken from their families, but not by force, by pride, by faith, by something that made parents hand them over willingly. And it was only the beginning, because when the voices of Providence sang together, the sound was not music, it was a door, and something had just opened. The camera drifts slowly upward, climbing the slope of a lonely hill. Fog rolls against the earth, clinging to the grass as though it does not want to let go. And at the summit, black against the pale sky, stand the parish. Its walls were stone, not the smooth, carved stone of wealth, but rough-hewn blocks dragged from the earth itself. They bore the marks of hands long gone, the grooves of chisels dulled by time. Between the cracks, moss clung thick, drinking the damp air of the hill. Above, the roof sloped steep, built to withstand winds that never seemed to stop. And in its center, a spire reached up like a finger pointing not toward heaven, but towards something it demanded notice from. The townspeople called it Our Lady of Providence, but most did not use that name. They simply called it the parish on the hill. Inside, the air never seemed to move. Even in summer, when the streets below sweltered, the nave held a cold that bit at the fingertips. Rows of wooden pews, scarred by knives and years of kneeling, lined the floor in perfect symmetry. And then there was the glass. Stained windows stretched high along the walls, taller than 2 men, filled with colors that seemed darker than light should allow. The saints in them did not smile. They stared down with eyes of crimson and cobalt, hands frozen mid-blessing. One pane, cracked from a storm decades earlier, leaked thin threads of morning sun. The light fell across the stone floor not in warmth, but like a wound. At the far end of the nave stood the organ. It was older than the parish. Older, some claimed, than the town itself. Its wood, blackened with oil and touch, seemed to resist the years, refusing rot. Its pipes stretched upward in towering ranks, each one whispering when the wind slid through. And when it played, the entire parish shifted. Locals said the sound didn't stop at the walls. It sank deeper, through the stone, into the soil beneath. And that was where the stories began. For generations, the elders had warned that the hill was not empty before the parish. Long before the first stone was placed, there had been monks, a cloister that sang beneath the earth, where voices rose in chambers no one ever found again. Some said their order vanished without record. Others whispered that they had not vanished at all, that their voices were still here, pressed into the rock. When the new choir began rehearsals in 1891, the hill stirred again. The sound of their practice carried down into the town. Mothers paused at windows, listening with pride. Shopkeepers stepped out into the street, hats in hand, faces tilted toward the hill. The voices were angelic, clear, high, but there was something else, a faint undertone, as if a second choir sang beneath them. One evening, a father walking home stopped at the base of the hill. His son's voice was among the chosen 19, and he wanted only to listen, just for a moment, before returning home. He heard the harmony swell, filling the dusk, and then he froze, because beneath the children's notes, something older answered back. It was lower, rougher, as though the earth itself had found a throat. He told no one that night, but others heard it too. The choir rehearsals grew longer. The priests insisted they sing until their voices broke, and then continue still. Mothers noted the hoarseness, the red throats, the way their children drank water, without ever quenching their thirst. Inside the parish, the sound was stranger still. The children stood in rows, their robes brushing flagstones. The choir master struck a note on the organ. The children followed. The pipes shook with vibration. And yet, behind the sound, another voice threaded through. Not one child, not even two, but many, breathing where no mouths moved. One girl, Anna, later told her mother that she thought someone was standing behind her in the nave. She had felt a warm breath on her neck as she sang. But when she turned, the row behind her was empty. The organist began complaining that the keys resisted him. His fingers pressed down, but the notes sometimes shifted. Chords he had not chosen bled into the air. He said it felt as though the organ wanted to play itself. And yet, the priest smiled. He said it was providence, that heaven itself had joined the children's song. But something wasn't right. One evening, as the rehearsal ended, the last note hung too long. The children closed their mouths. The organ fell silent, and yet the sound carried on, echoing through the rafters, rolling down the nave, until even the candles guttered. Parents waiting outside glanced at one another, because they could still hear it after the doors opened. The town began to change. Those who lived closest to the hill claimed they heard chanting at night. Not loud, not even clear, just a rhythm of voices, low and steady, pulsing beneath their sleep. A blacksmith's wife swore she heard her own name whispered in it. But no one would speak these things aloud, not to the priest, not even to one another, because the parish was providence. It was holy ground. To question it was to question God. Yet even the children began to notice. Thomas Bell told his brother that when he closed his eyes during rehearsal, he saw shadows in the stained glass. The saints seemed to shift, their mouths parting, their eyes fixed not on heaven, but on him. Another boy refused to stand near the organ. He said he heard knocking from inside its pipes, like fists striking metal from the wrong side. But they sang anyway, because they were chosen, because their parents watched with pride, because the parish demanded it. And as the nights grew darker, the voices beneath the hill grew stronger, until one evening, the townspeople waiting at the base of the hill swore they heard two choirs, one of children and one of men. But when they climbed the hill, opening the doors to see for themselves, the parish was nearly empty. The children stood silent at the altar, the organ keys unmoved, and yet for a moment, the sound had not stopped. It had only gone deeper, as if it had returned to where it had always belonged. Beneath the hill, the camera drifts slowly across the parish interior, the glass panes catching faint morning light, the colors bleeding red and blue against the walls. The air looks heavy, as if the stone itself is listening. The camera moves closer, toward the altar, and there a book lies open. It was the choir master who brought it forward, not a psalter, not one of the worn hymnals the children had been using since their first rehearsals. This book was slimmer, bound in leather darker than ink, and when he opened it, the pages gave off a faint, dry crackle. The notes inside were strange. The staff lines bent faintly, the measures drawn longer than standard. It looked almost careless, as though copied quickly, and yet every word was careful, every phrase deliberate. The title bore no familiar name. The hymn was written in red ink. The choir master told the children it would be their finest piece, that it had been preserved by the parish for generations. Hidden until now, waiting for a choir strong enough to sing it, the children stared at the pages, their eyes catching on the faded crimson script. The letters were sharp, curling, more like scratches in handwriting. He asked them to begin. The first note rose, tentative, voices weaving together in the nave. And then the sound broke. One girl, Anna, stopped singing, clutching her throat. She whispered that it hurt. The note sat too low, too heavy, pressing against her chest like stone. The choir master corrected her posture, told her to breathe deeper, to push through. The others tried again. This time, their voices wavered. The harmony did not sound like harmony at all. The intervals clashed, dissonant, grinding against the ear. Even the organ hesitated, its pipes groaning as the choir master pressed keys. But something wasn't right. The nave, already cold, grew colder still. A breeze moved against the children's ankles. Though the doors were shut, the windows locked. The candles along the altar guttered, the flames stretching as if pulled by an unseen draft. The children stopped. The sound did not. It lingered, a faint vibration against the walls, low enough that it might have been mistaken for the groan of the stone itself. The choir master turned the page. He urged them again. Once more, he said, with strength. They obeyed, but the notes cut into them. Voices cracked, throats strained. Some children held their hands against their chests as though something pressed down from the inside. Thomas Bell whispered to the boy beside him that it felt like he was singing someone else's voice, that the words in his mouth weren't his own. The choir master silenced him with a glance. The practice dragged on. Outside, mothers waiting by the gates whispered among themselves. They said the voices sounded thinner, weaker, not angelic as before. But when they asked their children that evening, the answers were evasive. The boys and girls only said that the new hymn was different, harder. Some confessed it hurt. Parents dismissed it. They told themselves discipline was always painful, that sacred music demanded sacrifice, and so the hymn remained. In the days that followed, rehearsals grew heavier. The children no longer sang with joy. Their voices entered the nave like smoke, reluctant, strained. And each time they sang the Reading hymn, the air inside the parish cooled until their breath hung visible. Frost began to gather faintly at the edges of the stained glass, even though spring was warming the fields below. One evening, Anna's mother wrapped her daughter's robe in wool, trying to keep her warm before practice. When Anna lifted her collar, her skin was mottled, pale as if she'd been standing outdoors for hours. But she said nothing. None of them did. During one rehearsal, the organist faltered. He claimed the instrument was resisting him. His hand struck one chord, but another rang out, a darker chord, layer beneath, as though the keys themselves had memory. And that's when he heard it, a second rhythm. Not the children, not the pipes. Something humming through the stone. He froze, his fingers suspended above the keyboard. But the priest, standing in shadow at the edge of the altar, nodded for him to continue. The choir master did not look away. The children sang again. The hymn carried through the rafters, bending against the wood. The sound felt wrong, like voices dragged through water, muffled, strained. But the longer they sang, the clearer it became, until the words were no longer words. They were cries. Each child looked pale when the hymn ended, their robes clinging with sweat despite the cold. The candles along the altar had gone out, one by one, without smoke, without air. The parents noticed their children changing. Their voices dropped into whispers when they spoke at home, their laughter rare, their eyes dull. Some refused to eat. Others woke at night, coughing, their throats raw. When asked what troubled them, some said it was the hymn, that it hurt, but mothers and fathers only tightened their grip on pride. Their children were chosen, their voices holy. It was not their place to question. And so the children returned. The book remained, and every night the parish grew colder, until the townspeople walking past the hill swore they could see their breath rise in clouds, even under a summer moon. And still the hymn was sung, for the choir master insisted it was Providence, and the priest never corrected him. But when Thomas Bell's father crept to the door one evening, pressing his ear against the heavy wood, he swore he heard two choirs again, the children, and something older, something answering from beneath the floor. He pulled back, chilled, because when the children's voices stopped, the second did not. It carried on, a single note, low and endless, as if the hymn had never ended, as if it would never end. The camera glides slowly through the parish doors, drifting past rows of wooden pews filled with families in their Sunday best. Hats lowered, heads bowed. The air is heavy, thick with expectation. At the far end of the nave, 19 children stand beneath the fractured light of the stained glass. It was their first performance. The voices of Providence. The parish had filled beyond capacity. Strangers from nearby towns had walked miles to hear them. The streets outside were lined with horses and wagons, their wheels locked in mud from the early spring rains. Mothers clutched infants close. Fathers shifted uncomfortably in the wooden pews. The organist rested his hands on the keys. The choir master raised his arm, and the children opened their mouths. The first note rang through the nave like crystal, pure, higher than breath, sharper than any instrument. The congregation gasped, struck by the beauty of it. Faces lifted toward the rafters, eyes wet with pride and awe. But something wasn't right. The sound was perfect, too perfect. Every voice locked together in flawless symmetry. No hesitation, no uneven breath, no stumble. It was not the song of 19 children. It was a song of one voice multiplied. The hymn carried on. It spread through the rafters, pressing against the beams until it seemed to hum. The stained glass rattled faintly, the colors quivering against the walls. Candles along the altar flickered, bending not backward or forward, but sideways, pulled toward the children. At first, the parish wept. They said it was heavenly, but then the unease began. One man near the back shifted on the pew, glancing toward the door. His wife whispered for him to stay, but he couldn't. The sound pressed against his ears, filling not just the nave, but his body. He felt it in his ribs, his teeth, the base of his skull, and that's when he heard it. The hymn didn't breathe. No pause, no measure, no rise or fall. It carried on without interruption, without the natural rhythm of lungs. He stood and left. Others followed. The priest did not move. The children did not blink. Their mouths stretched wide, their throats taut, voices pouring like a single stream of water that never ran dry. Some parishioners whispered prayers. Others clenched their hands until the skin broke, and still the sound went on. The hymn seemed endless, notes bending longer, words stretching thin, until the language dissolved into pure sound. Some swore they heard their own names woven faintly into the harmony. Others swore they heard nothing human at all. But no one could remember when it ended. One moment, the children were singing, and the next, silence. The shift was so sudden it broke the congregation. Men gasped, women sobbed, infants shrieked into the void. The air felt heavier, colder, as though something had just left the room, or entered it. The choir master lowered his hand. The organist closed the book of hymns, his fingers trembling. The children stood in silence, pale, sweat dampening the edges of their robes. Their mouths closed, but their chests rose and fell too quickly, as if they had been running. The priest stepped forward, announcing performance a success. His voice was steady, his words calm, but his eyes never looked at the congregation. They fixed only on the 19 children. Outside, parishioners left in silence. Some muttered that the hymn had not ended, that it was still ringing faintly in their ears, vibrating through their skulls. Others said it had stopped too suddenly, that no song could end without cadence, without resolution. One woman, clutching her shawl against her chest, whispered that she could still feel it in her lungs, that when she tried to breathe, the note was inside her. No one answered her. That night, many did not return to their homes. They walked instead down streets and across fields, as though seeking silence that did not exist. Farmers swore they heard the song still, drifting faintly from a hill, though the parish stood dark. The children returned to their homes pale, exhausted. When their parents asked about the hymn, none of them spoke, not a word. They sat silently at their tables, staring at the floor, and when they slept, some were heard humming, low, steady, the same unbroken note. But when shaken awake, their mouths were closed. The parish announced another performance the following week, and though the pews would be full again, those who had left early that day never returned. because they knew something the others did not. The hymn had not ended. It was still being sung. Only now, no one could tell where the sound was coming from. The camera rises slowly from the darkened town below, climbing the hill in silence. The parish looms above, its windows dim, its spire cutting into the night sky. The streets are empty. Only the sound of wind carries through the valley. But then a faint glow. From inside the parish, light stirs. Red, not gold, not the yellow warmth of candles, but a deep ember hue, seeping through stained glass and bleeding across the hill. It was the first of the midnight rehearsals. The priest had ordered them without explanation. Parents were told to bring their children back to the parish after dark, to dress them in robes, to leave them at the doors, and to go home. At first, the town resisted. Children did not belong in the parish at night, but the priest's authority was firm, and the parents' pride was stronger, so the hill filled with footsteps after dusk, mothers clutching cloaks against the cold, fathers gripping lanterns. 19 children gathered at the doors, their faces pale in the moonlight. The choir master led them inside. The doors closed, and the town was left with silence until the singing began. The voices spilled to the parish walls, clearer at night than by day. The sound traveled down the hill, winding through streets, pouring into windows. Families froze where they stood. Some wept, some knelt. At first, it was beautiful, but something wasn't right. The voices multiplied. It began with 19, distinct, pure. Then it grew, 30, 40, 100, rising, swelling, layered one atop another until it felt as though the entire hill was alive with sound. Villagers stepped outside their homes, looking toward the parish. The windows pulsed red, flickering as if fire raged within. But no smoke rose from the roof. No flames touched the spire. One man swore he saw shadows move behind the stained glass. Not children's shadows. Taller, broader, dozens of figures swaying where no one stood. And yet inside, there were only 19. The children sang until their voices broke, their throats raw, their lips trembling, but the sound did not falter. Even as mouths closed, the hymn carried on. The choir master did not stop them. The priest did not speak. The hymn continued until midnight. And then silence. The glow faded. The doors opened. Parents gathered their children, silent, weary, their eyes fixed to the ground. No one spoke of what they had heard. No one dared. But the hymn followed them home. That night, Thomas Bell's father woke to a sound in his own house. The creak of floorboards, the hush of fabric brushing wood. He rose, lantern in hand, moving down the hallway. And that's when he heard it. A whisper, soft, breathless, threading through the air like a draft. He pushed open the door to his son's room. Thomas lay in bed, eyes closed, his lips moving. His chest rose and fell to quickly, shallow, strained. And from his mouth came to him, not in voice, but in whisper, low, endless, as if his lungs were not his own. The father shook him awake. Thomas gasped, eyes wide, confused. He swore he had been dreaming, but when asked what he dreamed of, he said nothing. The next night, the parish called him again. And again, the hill filled with light. Again, the voices multiplied. Again, the windows glowed red. By the third night, the town stopped watching. Families shut their shutters tight, burying their ears beneath pillows. Some fled to neighboring villages. Others locked their children's doors, afraid of what they might hear in the dark. But the hymn crept through the cracks. It rattled in the beams. It groaned in the floors. It lingered in the lungs of those who tried not to listen. One woman claimed she woke to find her infant humming, mouth closed. The choir master wrote nothing down. No record of these midnight sessions exists. The hymn itself remained in that book with red ink, always brought out at dusk, always taken away before dawn. But the children remembered. They remembered the cold that thickened with each note, the way their breath rose in white clouds inside the nave, even as sweat soaked their robes. They remembered the shadows on the glass, and they remembered the way the sound did not end when they stopped singing, because even now in their sleep, their mouths whispered it still. and the parents began to wonder if the voices they heard at night were really their children's at all. The camera drifts slowly across the hill. The parish rises in silence, black against a pale October moon. Leaves scatter in the wind, dry and brittle, sweeping across the stone steps that climb to its doors. The air is sharp, cold enough that every breath leaves a faint white cloud. It was the 31st of October. The church announced a midnight mass, a rare service, unspoken of in years past. Families were told to attend, children to be dressed in robes. The parish bells tolled late into the evening, calling them up the hill, and the town obeyed. One by one, lanterns flickered along the path, cloaks pulled tight, mothers holding hands that trembled, fathers walking stiff, their eyes fixed on the ground. The children moved in silence, 19 of them, their faces hidden in hoods. At the doors, the priest stood waiting, his robes darker than the night, his hands clasped at his chest. Behind him, the choir master held the red book, the same book seen at every rehearsal, its corners worn, its ink bleeding faintly through the parchment. The children entered, the parents followed, the nave filled with whispers and shuffling feet, the sound of benches creaking as the congregation sat. Candles lined the altar, hundreds of them, their flame steady, but their light strange, not warm, not gold, but dull, as though something unseen had drawn the color out of the wax. The hymn began. At first it was low, a gentle rise of voices, soft enough to still the restless air, the children's tones weaving together, slow and measured. The red book opened at the center, but something wasn't right. The doors had closed. Heavy oak, iron-banded, pulled shut from the inside. The sound of the bolt sliding into place echoed through the nave. No one had touched it. Parents exchanged glances. Uneasy, some shifted to stand, but the priest raised a hand, his face still, his eyes fixed only on the choir. The children's voices swelled. The hymn grew louder, stronger, notes held longer than breath should allow, layered, thick, pressing against the walls. And then another sound. From outside, villagers who had not entered the parish stopped along the road. They tilted their heads toward the church. The music was pouring through the stone, vibrating across the hill, but woven into it was something else. A scream, faint at first, hidden beneath the melody. Then another, and another, high-pitched, sharp, twisting around him like a thread of fire. The voices of children crying out. But inside, the congregation sat frozen, because the hymn never faltered. The children at the altar sang on, their faces pale, their mouths open wide. Not one broke rhythm, not one showed pain. And yet the screams did not stop. They rose, louder now, breaking to music in shrieks that rattled the pews. Women clutched their ears. Men pressed hands against the wood, as if to steady themselves. Still the priest did not move. Still the doors stayed locked. Witnesses outside said the windows glowed red, brighter than before. The stained glass lit from within as though the stone itself were burning. They claimed they saw shadows press against the glass. Faces, hands, figures writhing where no one stood. And then silence, so sudden, it felt like the air itself had been cut away. The hymn stopped mid-note. The screams vanished. The hill fell still. Not a breath carried. Not a bird stirred in the trees. The candles inside guttered once, then held. The parish sat heavy in the dark, sealed from the world. No sound followed. Not for minutes. Not for hours. The villagers waited along the road. Parents stood at the doors, beating their fists against the wood until skin split. But nothing answered. The mass had ended, but no one walked out. And by dawn, the parish stood silent. The doors locked, the windows dark, the red glow gone as though it had never been. Inside there were no voices, only empty pews, and an altar bare candles. The hymn was never sung again. But those who stood outside swore one thing, that in the final note before silence, they heard their own names carried in the song. The nave lay in silence when the doors were forced open, Silence so heavy it seemed to press itself against the lungs of the men who entered, and for a moment no one moved, because it felt like stepping into a room where something had just happened, something unseen but still present, like breath lingering in the air after the speaker has vanished. The lanterns swung in their hands, spilling orange light across empty pews polished smooth by decades of prayer, pews that should have been full but were not, their straight backs waiting for parishioners who would never sit again. Hymnals lay scattered across the benches, each one turned to the same page, their edges frayed, their thin black lettering ordinary enough, except for one page in each book marked in ink that was red, not printed, but written, each curve of the notes precise, each line the same, as though whoever had set them there had pressed too deeply, staining the paper with something more than ink. The officials did not speak at first. They only walked slowly, their boots echoing on a flagstone floor, and every sound seemed too loud against the silence that wrapped itself over everything like a thick woolen cloth. The church smelled faintly of wax and stone dust, of something burned but not yet gone, and though it was late morning when the doors were opened, the interior seemed darker than it should have been. Shadows gathered in corners that the lanterns did not touch. One of the men bent down and lifted a hymnal, his hand trembling not because of weight, but because the book felt oddly warm, as though it had been closed only a moment before, as though the singers had only just stepped away. He looked around, hoping to catch sight of them, perhaps huddled in the vestry, perhaps hiding in the choir loft, but the loft was bare, its benches empty, the rail polished, no dust disturbed. "They're gone," someone whispered, though no one had asked, and the words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have, as if they were being repeated back in a voice not their own. Another man pressed forward, determined to check the altar. The cloth was smooth, the candles long since melted to stubs, their wicks extinguished but bent as though they had been burning until only recently. And then, just as his hand brushed the wood of the altar, there came a sound that made them all freeze. It was the organ, one note, low, drawn out, breathing through the pipes though no hand pressed the keys. The men turned together, their lanterns swinging wildly across the chancel, shadows leaping against the walls, but the bench was empty, the polished keys untouched, the stops unmoved, yet the notes sustained, deep and trembling, as though the instrument itself exhaled against them. They waited for it to fade, but it did not fade. It ended, abruptly, as though someone had cut the air itself. The silence that followed was worse, because it was not merely absence of sound, but something closer, heavier, a silence that felt alive. The men shifted, uneasy now. Their mission no longer the simple task of forcing open locked doors, but something far more disturbing, to explain how an entire choir could vanish mid-song, leaving no trace but open books and a sound still lingering in memory. One of them climbed the pulpit stairs, slowly, carefully, his lantern lifted high, and from that vantage he could see everything. The pews, the altar, the organ, the entrance, and all of it was empty, unnaturally so, the kind of emptiness that did not simply happen but had been made. He saw, too, that every hymnal, every single one, was turned to the same page, as though instructed, as though the singers had followed a command none of the officials understood. And on that page, in that same red hand, the hymn had no ending bar, no final note, no place for voices to stop. It stretched across the staves like a road that refused to conclude, as though the act of singing had no destination, only continuation. One of the men whispered that the children must have fled, frightened, hiding in the woods, but another shook his head. There had been people outside, standing at the edges of the night, listening. They had heard it, the hymn. They had heard the voices lift. Pure at first, then strained, then breaking into something else. They had heard screams woven into melody, like thread through cloth, so that one could not be untangled from the other. And then, just as the organ had done now, it had stopped, not tapered, not diminished. Stopped, and when it did, the building fell silent, locked from within, the cries cut short as though the very air had been pressed from lungs. The officials fanned out, calling softly, their voices hesitant. "Is anyone here?" But no voice returned. Their steps carried them into the vestry, the sacristy, the small back rooms where vestments hung and chalices waited. But nothing stirred, no hidden children huddled against walls, no choir master clutching his robes. In one room a chair lay overturned, its legs twisted against the floor, but no one could say when or why it had fallen. The windows were latched, the doors secured. Dust lay evenly across the sill, unbroken by flight. The disappearance was not one of movement, it was one of erasure. And in that moment, standing in the center of the parish, lanterns trembling, books open, organs silent, each of them knew the same thing without speaking it. The 19 children were gone. Not missing, not fled, gone. The silence did not release them as they left the church that day. It followed them into the street, into their homes, into their sleep. Some said the sound of the organ's last note lingered for weeks, a hum beneath conversation, a tone beneath every word. Others swore that at night, when their houses were quiet, they could hear the faint turning of pages, as if hymnals were being opened again, somewhere just out of sight. But the fact remained. When the sun fell and rose again, the parish was empty, and the voices of the choir had been swallowed whole. And that was the moment when unease turned to fear, because they had not simply lost a choir. They had lost 19 children, and no one could explain where they had gone. But the hymn remained, and those who had heard it swore it never ended. Not really. It was still going on, somewhere, waiting. Its frame lingers on the stone walls of the parish. Shut, locked, windows black, grass growing high against the door. The church was closed. The announcement came quietly, without ceremony. A single letter, pinned to the notice board at the gates. Typed words. Cold. Final. It claimed that the children had been sent away. No destination listed. No records attached. No explanation offered. The letter hung there for weeks. The ink blurred in the rain. And the words never changed. But something wasn't right. Parents came. At first, they knocked on the doors, calling their children's names. They waited, huddled in the wet grass outside, believing the locks would turn, believing a mistake would be corrected. But no doors opened, no windows cracked, no voices answered. In time, they marched to the diocese office, a narrow building whitewashed, its corridors echoing with the sound of their footsteps. Mothers and fathers carrying worn photographs, tiny portraits of sons and daughters, captured in school uniforms, their faces still round with youth. They demanded answers, and what they received were lines rehearsed, polite, firm, delivered with the calm voice of a clerk who has been told what to say and nothing more. The children had been sent away, for study, for care, for their safety. The story shifted with each telling, but the conclusion never moved. They were gone. No files were shown, no dates, no signatures, only words. And when the parents pressed harder, the records vanished. Attendance logs, once neatly written in the parish registry, were gone. School rosters, once marked with check marks beside familiar names, erased. Even the baptismal book, thick with pages bound in leather, now showed blank lines where the children's names had once been written. It was as if they had never existed. But the parents remembered. Their grief refused to be written away. So they stood at the gates of the church each Sunday. They waited with placards. They sang prayers aloud, voices breaking, reaching through the locked wood. They demanded the return of their children. The priest did not meet them. They stayed inside their residences, curtains drawn, their figures barely glimpsed behind the glass. And when, at last, a priest did appear, he carried something in his hands. It was a hymnal, its pages fragile, its cover worn from years of touch. Behind him, a fire pit glowed in the courtyard. One by one, he dropped the books inside. Their pages curled, their ink darkened. The hymn the children had been singing, was reduced to smoke. The crowd shouted. Some broke forward, hands reaching, desperate to save a fragment, a page, a note. But the priests barred them back, and the fire consumed every line. By dusk, nothing was left, only ash drifting into the sky, only silence pressing down the hill. The message was clear. There would be no music, no words, no trace, and those who tried to keep the memory alive were silenced. A mother, speaking at the market, telling neighbors she had heard her daughter's voice in a dream. She was dismissed her stall overturned, her produce scattered in the mud. A father, writing letters to the paper, describing the sound of the final hymn. His name was struck from the rolls of his trade. He was left without work. A boy, older brother to one of the missing, whispered to his classmates that he had heard the organ still playing at night. He was taken aside by a teacher, his mouth bruised, his words beaten out of him. The silence spread, more powerful than law, more binding than decree, and soon the hill was left untouched. The parents grew thin from grief, their protests quieter each week, until at last they stopped coming. They stayed in their homes, curtains drawn, photographs hidden away, but silence is never perfect. On some nights, when the air grew still and the mist hung low over the valley, something carried down from the church. Not loud, not clear, but there, music, thin, faint, notes drifting like breath through stone. Those who heard it said it was always the same. A few bars, never finishing, repeating, lingering, as though the hymn had never stopped, as though it was still being sung, not by children alive, not by voices present, but by something else, something bound to the building, bound to the words that were meant to be burned. The officials said nothing. The diocese remained silent. The church remained locked. But the hill carried music, and those who lived beneath it knew the hymn had not been destroyed. It had only been denied, and denial does not end a song. It only forces it deeper, until one night it is heard again, waiting, and that was the moment the silence stopped feeling empty. It began to feel alive. The camera moves slowly over the ridge. A ruined parish sits alone, black stone against the pale of winter. Its roof slants like a broken spine. Its windows gape hollow, glass long gone. Snow gathers in the valley. Snow gathers in the trees. But not on the roof. Not once. Not ever. For decades, the building has been left untouched. The diocese gave no explanation. The officials refused to answer. The gates were locked, and the hill was left to rot. But silence does not stay still forever. In the 1970s, hikers began to wander near the parish. Young men, carrying packs and maps, eager to climb the ridge above it. They said the church was no more than a landmark, a ruin, an old story. But the hill had a way of listening. One group, 3 men, stopped to rest near the gates. It was cold. Their breath fogged the air, and from inside the church came a sound. At first, they thought it was a wind, a low draft, slipping through stone. But the notes began to rise, patterned, measured, almost like voices. They pressed closer to the fence. The sound sharpened. It was a choir, but something wasn't right. The words carried no meaning. Not in Latin, not in English, not in any tongue they knew. The syllables twisted, elongated, reversed, as though the voices were pulling language apart. One of the men carried a recorder. He lifted it, hands shaking, and pressed play. The tape whirred. The voices filled the reel. When they returned home, they played it back, and what they heard was not what they remembered. It was sharper, colder, layered with tones that had not been present in the air. Some swore there were hundreds of voices. Others claimed they heard children. One said he heard his own name, sung in the midst of it. The tape was passed around the town. Some dismissed it as static. Others listened once and refused to hear again. But the hikers knew. They had stood at the fence. They had felt the voices inside their bones. And still, snow never touched the roof. Each winter, locals watched, the valley blanketed in white, roofs and roads alike. Every surface softened, every edge blurred, except the parish. Its black roof glistened bare. Rain rolled, ice clung, but snow would not settle. It was as if the building rejected weight, as if no white could cover what it held. Older residents began to whisper. Some said the roof was too warm, though no fire had burned there in decades. Others said snow was a blessing, and blessings avoided the parish. At the fence line, more signs appeared. Scratches. At first, they seemed random. Small marks, etched into the stone pillars, thin as fingernail cuts. But over the years, they grew into letters, names, dozens of them, then hundreds. the names of the choir, the children who had once sung inside. Every letter carved deep, though no one claimed to have cut them. Locals swore the names were accurate, that they matched old rosters, long erased in the diocese records. Names that should not have survived. And still more appeared. Late at night, under frost and moonlight, villagers walking past the hill would stop and stare. New scratches glistened white in the stone, freshly carved, wet with frost. Some swore they saw movement by the gates. Not a figure, not a face, just hands, small, reaching, and then the sound would return. On certain nights, the choir rose again, not always for long, sometimes no more than a phrase, sometimes lasting until dawn. One hiker described it as standing at the bottom of a well, hearing water drip, distant, unreachable, but steady. Another swore the sound carried into his dreams, that he woke with the music still in his head and the taste of cold iron on his tongue. And when he returned to the hill weeks later, his name was there, scratched into the stone, letter by letter, as if it had been waiting. The locals will not go near it now. The path has grown over with weeds, though the fence still stands. The parish sits empty, windows hollow, roof bare, but recordings still surface. Old reels, traded in secret, capturing the sound of voices in languages unknown. Some say the tapes change over time, that what is heard on the first playback is never what is heard on the second. And once, only once, someone played a recording backward. What they heard was not singing. It was breathing, long, slow, patient, as if the parish itself was waiting. And that is why the silence that follows the hymn is worse than the hymn itself, because the silence holds breath, and breath means something is still inside. The parish waits, black stone against a pale horizon. Its walls crumble, its windows gape open, its roof still bare of snow. It has not changed in decades, and yet something lingers. 19 voices once rose from inside these walls. 19 children, a choir, a single hymn, and then silence. No explanation was ever given. No bodies recovered. No graves marked. Only silence. But silence is not nothing. Silence is weight. Silence can press against the skin like a hand. For those who come near the parish, that silence is almost unbearable. It does not sound like emptiness. It sounds like waiting. Some say the choir was a sacrifice, that they were victims of a ritual too old for memory. Others whisper they were chosen, that the voices did not end here, but ascended into something else. But no matter the theory, no matter the story, one truth remains. The parish is sealed, and those who linger too long at its gates do not leave unchanged. One winter evening, a man named Fenton stopped by the fence. He was not from the village. He was only passing through, but he had heard the rumors, and curiosity held him there. The ground was frozen beneath his boots. Frost rimmed the iron bars, and from within there was nothing, no movement, no sound, only the hollow frame of a ruined church. But the silence pressed harder the longer he stayed. It felt less like absence and more like a pause. And then he realized he was holding his breath. When he let it out, it echoed back to him, soft, drawn out, as if the parish had exhaled in return. He stumbled back. His heart quickened. The silence swelled again. And that's when he heard it. A single note. High, thin, unmistakably a voice. It lasted only a second, and then it was gone. But the sound clung to him. He could not sleep that night. The note returned in his dreams. Not as music, as warning. When Fenton awoke, he told no one. But weeks later, his name appeared scratched into the stone at the parish gates. Letter by letter. Neat. Deliberate. He never returned. The locals, however, still watch, still listen, and still whisper. They say the choir's song has not ended, that it waits in silence like breath before word, that the 19 voices are still gathered, suspended between this world and another. And on certain nights when the wind dies, the silence sharpens. A rhythm emerges, almost a pattern. Not quite music, not quite language, but something close, as if the parish is still tuning itself. preparing for a second hymn, and those who hear it never mistake it for imagination, because the sound always carries the same undertone, the sense that the voices know you are listening. The parish has been fenced off now for decades. The diocese denies it exists. The village denies it too, but still people come, drawn to the hill, standing at the gates, waiting in silence. Some swear they hear the faintest beginnings of a song. Others say they only feel it, a vibration in the chest, low and steady. But all agree on one thing. The choir that sang once is not finished, and when the song begins again, it will not stop, not until every name is carved in stone, not until the silence finally breathes out, not until the parish sings again. The choir's fate reflects how faith can sanctify, but also silence. The children were offered as voices of heaven, yet vanish into something nameless.